before the silver-plated armor gleamed in sunlight, before titles were earned and banners flew above stone keeps, there was mud, and blood, and fear. Every knight's tale begins far from the glory sung by minstrels in candlelit halls. Before the ceremony, before the sword laid upon the shoulder, there was a boy, unmade, unknown, tested not by destiny but by drudgery. And in the year of our Lord 1173, on the outer fringes of Northumbria, where mist hung thick and wolves still howled in the hills, a boy named Thomas de Warenne knelt not in prayer, but because his legs had given out. The cold morning air stung his skin. His knuckles bled from splintered wood. His ribs ached from practiced blows dealt without mercy. And still he held the sword dulled and heavy, not out of strength, but because dropping it meant failure. And failure in the house of Ser Baldwin meant more than shame. It meant being cast back to the world of peasants. Forgotten. He was no noble son. His father kept the accounts of a minor lord. His mother healed the wounded with roots and boiling water. Yet Thomas had been offered a rare path upward. A squire's place under Ser Baldwin of Thornridge, a knight known more for his iron discipline than any courtly grace. Baldwin had fought at geysers, bled at Muntelharry, and once cleaved a man's skull in two before a siege wall. The stories said he never laughed, never wept, never forgave. And this was the man tasked with shaping Thomas, a boy who'd never held a real sword, into something worthy of armor. Each morning began before the sun, hauling buckets, mucking stalls, mending saddles, and then came the drills, hour after hour of footwork, blade work, bruises, and insults. No praise, no kindness, only the weight of expectation. Yet, in that brutal silence, something began to change. Not quickly, not painlessly, but like iron in a forge, struck and shaped. By night, Thomas could barely lift his arms. He slept in straw, not sheets. He ate bread hardened to stone, drank water tinged with rust. But he endured, for in the solitude of that barn, under flickering torchlight, he began to whisper the nightly vows to himself. He did not yet understand them, not truly. To serve with honor, to protect the weak, to speak truth. Words he had heard but never lived. Still, he clung to them, as if the act of saying them could make them real. He imagined the life of a knight as something more than bloodshed, as something sacred, a light in a dark world. And so, battered and broken though he was, he rose again each morning. Not for Baldwin, not even for pride, but for the belief that somewhere beyond the muck, a better self waited to be forged. The sword was not yet part of him, but the desire to be worthy of it was already burned into his soul. Then one night everything changed. As the wind howled and torches guttered in their brackets, a rider galloped into the yard, his horse frothing, breathless. Raiders had come down from the northern hills, wild men, Saxon holdouts, or worse. Blood had been spilled. The Baron was calling every sword, every shield, every man who could ride. Ser Baldwin did not hesitate. He buckled on his battered chainmail without a word. And as Thomas watched in silence, the knight turned and tossed him a helmet. "You're coming." No ceremony, no speech, just a command. And in that moment, the boy understood. The training was over. The proving ground was behind him. What came next was war. There is a silence before battle that no bard ever sings of. A silence not of peace, but of breath held, as if the world itself pauses to listen. That morning, Thomas rode out for the first time not as a boy behind a broom or a blade in training, but as a squire in armor that did not fit. The chainmail hung too loose on his shoulders. The helmet tilted when he turned. His sword bounced awkwardly at his side, as if reminding him with every step that he wasn't ready. But readiness did not matter. The Baron had summoned every man, and Baldwin had spoken just 4 words. "You're riding with me." And so he rode, his heart pounding louder than the hooves beneath him, flanked by grizzled soldiers who smelled of iron, horse sweat, and old wounds. Their eyes did not look at him. Not out of cruelty, but because in their world, a boy in ill-fitting armor was a ghost already. Unmade, unlikely to return. The village of Eld Hollow was not much, a scatter of thatched huts, a wooden chapel, and a single narrow bridge across the stream. Smoke rose from 2 roofs before they even arrived. The raiders, Saxons by the look of them, or perhaps mercenaries left over from some forgotten war, had come fast and brutal. No siege, no warnings, just fire and steel. As Baldwin dismounted and drew his blade, Thomas could feel his own hands trembling, slick with sweat despite the chill. He clutched the small round shield Baldwin had given him, chipped, splintered, more a memory than protection, and followed. Into the smoke, into the screaming, into war. What he saw in those next moments would never leave him. A mother sobbing over a bloodied bundle. A man with his throat half open crawling through the dirt. Chickens flapping madly in flames. And amid it all, Baldwin, calm as stone, cutting through men as if they were reeds in a river. Efficient, relentless, not for glory, for duty. Thomas froze when the first man charged him. Not a raider, but a boy, no older than himself, with wild eyes and a rusted axe. The world slowed. Every part of him screamed to run, to hide, to wake up. But instinct, or perhaps training, moved his arm. He raised the shield just in time. The axe clanged off wood. Pain burst through his shoulder. And then Baldwin's sword split the attacker's back, and the boy was gone. Just like that, a life ended in front of him. Not noble, not grand, just blood and breath, and then stillness. Thomas dropped to his knees, vomiting. But there was no time to grieve, no time to reflect. The village still burned, and Baldwin shouted again, orders, curses, movements. Thomas rose, wiping his mouth, sword still in hand. He moved not like a knight, but like a man who now understood what death looked like, and how close it had come. By nightfall, the fighting was done. What remained was ash. The village was saved, if saving could include burned homes and 20 dead. But the raiders were broken, a dozen slain, the rest fled into the woods. Baldwin stood over a pile of enemy weapons, face unreadable. And then, for the first time, he looked at Thomas, really looked. Not as a burden, not as a servant, but as someone who had stood, even when he could have run. He said nothing. He didn't need to. That look, that silent acknowledgement, was the first thread of knighthood winding its way into Thomas's soul. And later that night, beside a campfire that gave little warmth, Thomas stared at his bloodied hands. Not his blood, someone else's, someone real. The words of the knightly vows echoed again in his mind, but they rang hollow now. Not because they were false, but because he finally understood their cost. Knighthood was not forged in ceremony. It was forged here, in the fire, the fear, and the terrible choices. And though Thomas had not yet earned his spurs, he had taken his first step toward the man. Oaths are spoken in moments of peace, in candlelit chapels before kings, before God. But they are paid for later in silence, in suffering, in decisions no song dares to mention. In the weeks following Eld Hollow, Thomas was no longer just the boy with shaking hands and borrowed armor. The men no longer ignored him. They didn't welcome him, not with cheers or jokes, but with nods, the kind only shared between those who've stood shoulder to shoulder where arrows fall and blades sing. He had not yet earned a title, but he had earned their silence, their grim respect. Baldwin said nothing of what happened. No congratulations. No critique. Just more drills. More marches. The work of war continued. But something had shifted in the way the knight looked at him. The contempt was gone. What remained was expectation. A heavier burden than hatred ever was. As the frost thickened and the sun dipped earlier each day, they traveled deeper into contested lands. Baron Greycross, Baldwin's liege, had entered a feud with a rival lord across the River Way. A broken marriage contract, an insult traded in court, and suddenly men were dying over honor. Thomas listened as knights justified it all. It is duty. He wronged our bloodline. We fight to preserve the law. But Thomas had walked through Eld Hollow. He had buried children. And in the quiet spaces between skirmishes, he began to wonder, was honor real? Or was it a word men used to decorate cruelty? Then came the test, not of sword, but of soul. In a small hamlet nestled in the woods, Baldwin's company cornered 3 deserters. Not from their side, from the enemy's. Tired, thin, wounded. One had a broken leg. They were farmers once, maybe still were. Men pulled from their fields and thrown into another lord's quarrel. They had fled the fight, thrown down arms, begged for mercy. And Baldwin, with the weight of command on his shoulders, ordered their execution. Traitors deserve no quarter. The men didn't cheer. No one wanted the task. And so he turned to Thomas. You've seen death. Now give it. The boy who once trembled under a wooden sword now stood with a steel blade drawn, facing 3 unarmed men. One wept. One prayed. One simply stared. Time slowed again. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper. A reckoning. Thomas had spoken those vows every night in the stables, to serve with honor, to protect the weak, to speak truth. And now those words demanded action. He looked to Baldwin, then to the men. His fingers tightened on the hilt. The blade shook, and then he dropped it. Silence fell. It was not defiance, not quite. It was something older, something sacred. A quiet refusal to trade his soul for obedience. Baldwin's jaw tightened, but he did not strike him. He simply took the sword and finished the order himself. Quick, clean, brutal, no lesson spoken, just blood in the snow. But that night, Baldwin sat beside the fire and said, softly, without looking at Thomas, a knight must carry both blade and conscience, but one will always weigh more. And that was the true beginning. Not when Thomas first held a sword, not when he first rode into war, but when he realized that oaths are not just words. They are chains and wings. They bind you. They define you. And every knight must decide what kind of man he will become when the cost of his oath comes due. Every knight must pass through darkness, not the darkness of night, but the kind that settles behind the eyes, the kind that questions everything you are. And in the winter of 1174, Thomas faced such a darkness, a test not designed by kings or priests, but by fate itself. It began with the siege of Calmere, a keep perched like a wound on the edge of contested land. A cold place, stone and snow and silence. The enemy was dug in, starving, but not broken. Baron Greycross demanded surrender. None came, so he ordered fire, iron, and fear. For weeks, Thomas served at Baldwin's side, enduring the slow grind of siege warfare. The glamour of battle faded fast. Days were spent repairing siege engines, fetching boiling pitch, dragging corpses from the lines before they rotted. At night, the screams from within the keep echoed like ghosts. Hunger does strange things to men. One morning, a woman tried to sneak out with her child. She was caught, the child crying, frostbitten, skin blue. Baldwin ordered food be given. The Baron rescinded it. "Starve them faster," he said. And for the first time, Thomas saw it clearly. Chivalry was not the language of lords. It was the armor men wore to make cruelty look clean. Then the breach came. The wall cracked on the 12th day. The soldiers rushed in. What followed was not a battle, it was a purge. Thomas moved through halls where defenders threw down swords, only to be cut down anyway. He saw a knight of their own cleave a man who had surrendered, not for vengeance, but for sport. And when he raised his voice, he was struck, warned. Mercy is treason now. He found Baldwin in the great hall, sword dripping, eyes cold. Around him, bodies. Thomas's voice broke as he asked, "This isn't justice, is it?" Baldwin didn't answer. He simply walked past. Later, Thomas wandered to the chapel inside the keep, or what was left of it. Statues shattered. Blood on the altar. A priest hanged in his own robes. He dropped to his knees, not in prayer, but in grief. Not for the dead, but for what he was becoming. The boy who once whispered vows in the stable was vanishing, buried beneath duty, orders, silence. He had learned to fight. He had learned to endure. But now, he had to learn how to carry the weight of seeing what nobility really looked like when the mask was stripped away. That night, Baldwin found him there. Neither spoke. For a long time, only the wind filled the ruined chapel. And then Baldwin said, "This is the trial no one prepares you for. Not the sword, not the siege, but surviving the truth." He sat beside Thomas, not as commander to Squire, but as man to man. And in that broken chapel, both understood what could not be said aloud. Knighthood was not about strength or victory or even honor. It was about holding fast to something human when the world demanded you become something less. This was Thomas's black trial, not marked by ceremony, but by silence, by blood that didn't belong to him, by a vow tested not by battle, but by what battle reveals. And though no herald sang of it, no scroll recorded it, something changed in him that night. The boy died, and in his place a man began to rise. Not yet a knight, but something far rarer, a soul who still believed, even in ruin, that a better path was possible.